Sir, is that a museum piece? The inquiry, infused with the casual cockiness of youth, pierced the strained hush of the shooting area. Sergeant Reese, scarcely 20, with a sculpted chin and a firearm that appeared crafted from a futuristic movie, gestured toward the elderly man's gun. Harlan Graves, 84 years old, did not pivot. His hands, aged and etched with the delicate traces of an extended existence, stayed firm on the battered wooden grip of his firearm. He reclined in the prone stance on his fabric pad, his form motionless, his respiration controlled. The sole motion was his single visible eye, surveying the 1,000 yards of wavering hot air to a mark that was barely a dot. Reese grinned at his teammates who snickered behind their palms. "License and registration on that thing, Grandpa," another one murmured. "Just audible enough to travel. Better verify if it's classified as a historical relic." Their own firearms were wonders of contemporary design. Black synthetic material adorned with tracks and add-ons, with optics the size of compact telescopes. Harlan's firearm was an antique of timber and polished metal. And the optic was the true punchline. It was slim with copper attachments and noticeable marks on its casing. In contrast to their advanced lenses, it resembled a plaything. The ridicule, which had begun as soft utterances when Harlan first unpacked his gun, now intensified. They were a group, youthful and robust, dressed in the sharp, pixelated camouflage of the current Marine Corps. They viewed an elderly man who appeared misplaced, an artifact who had strayed into their intense realm of accurate marksmanship. This was the all-Marine rifle contest, a display of the finest sharpshooters in the Corps. To them, Harlan was a disgrace, a benign but pitiful fragment of animated past that was delaying the proceedings. "Look at the finish on that stock," Reese stated, his tone oozing with disdain. "Bet he used it to row a boat back in the era." "That scope's probably got more dust inside than glass," his companion, a lance corporal named Hayes, contributed. "Can he even spot the target from here?" The range officer should examine his vision, not his firearm. The remarks were like pebbles skimmed over a serene lake, each creating a broader wave. Other participants, younger individuals at their peak, started to observe. They noticed the bunch of chuckling Marines and the elderly man they were aiming at. A few appeared uneasy, but nobody stepped in. Reese was a recognized ace, a leading marksman from his group, and his assurance was contagious. The onlookers' unspoken agreement appeared to be that the elderly man was out of place. Emboldened by the spectators, Reese chose to intensify. This was no longer mere amusement. It was about criteria. This senior and his outdated equipment were a possible danger to safety. He rose and marched to the range safety supervisor, a gunnery sergeant Harlan, with a visage like stone and the endurance of a counting timer. "Gunny, I've got a worry," Reese declared, raising his voice for impact. He indicated back at Harlan. "That participant's gear. It doesn't seem standard. Honestly, it doesn't appear secure. I'm concerned about a malfunction." Or worse, the whole shooting area fell silent. A straightforward contest to another participant's equipment was a grave action. Gunnery Sergeant Harlan's eyes constricted. He was obligated by rules to probe any safety issue. With a deep exhale, he proceeded along the row, his footwear grinding on the pebbles, each stride resounding in the abrupt quiet. He halted next to Harlan's pad. "Sir," the gunny stated, his tone expert but resolute, "I've gotten a grievance about your weapon setup. I need to review it." Harlan gradually, intentionally elevated himself to a seated pose. He did not appear furious or ashamed. He merely seemed fatigued, as though this was a disruption he had endured countless times previously. He lifted the firearm and passed it to Gunnery Sergeant Harlan. The gunny accepted the gun. He operated the mechanism. It shifted with a fluidity that only arises from years of careful upkeep. He inspected the chamber, the tube, the firing mechanism. It was ancient, yes, the coloring was faded to a silvery glow in spots, and the wood was shadowy with time and lubricant, but it was impeccably preserved. He then scrutinized the optic, peering at the vintage lens. "She's sighted in, Gunny," Harlan remarked, his voice a deep, consistent growl. "She'll perform the task." Gunnery Sergeant Harlan could discover no valid safety breach. The firearm was reliable, but the influence from Reese and the anticipating gazes of the other Marines pressed on him. "The rifle passes inspection," he declared to the row, "but it is a non-conventional item of gear." Sir, you can continue, but be informed any functional breakdown, any problem whatsoever, and you will be promptly removed from the contest. He returned the firearm. As Harlan received it, his thumb grazed over a profound irregular mark in the metallic enclosure of the optic just adjacent to the wind adjustment dial. For a brief instant, the brilliant sunlit range faded. The aroma of newly mowed turf and explosive residue was supplanted by the dense metallic odor of blood and forest decay. The distant pops of rifles transformed into the overwhelming thunder of rapid fire and the stomach-twisting howl of approaching projectiles. He was 20 years old once more, his face pressed against this identical grip, his fingers pale as he clutched this identical firearm. The mark was not present yet. A voice, youthful and vibrant, yelled over the turmoil. It was his observer, Ramon. Keep her stable, Har. Make it matter. The recollection disappeared as swiftly as it arrived. A burst of lightning in his thoughts, but it left a calm in its aftermath. A frigid, solid concentration that eradicated the clamor of the mocking Marines and the gunny's caution. The mark was not harm, it was a blemish, a memento. He returned to his prone stance, the accustomed heaviness of the firearm a solace. The embarrassment was a tangible entity now, a thick cover over the whole range. The young Marines were no longer murmuring. They were publicly wagering, their tones assured. $10 says he won't even strike the sheet. 20 says the old optic will detach after the initial discharge. Reese, feeling justified, just shook his head with a dramatic sympathy. In the modest array of seats behind the shooting row, a man sat observing. He was older than the gunny, but younger than Harlan, with a rigid, upright bearing that even casual attire couldn't conceal. This was Josiah Kane, a former master gunnery sergeant and a myth in the competitive marksmanship community. He hadn't arrived to observe the aces like Reese. He had come because he'd heard a whisper that an ancient name from the annals was going to be on the road today. He had witnessed the whole episode develop, a knot of revulsion forming in his gut. He saw the refined haughtiness of the young Marines, and he saw the serene, unyielding honor of Harlan Graves. He identified the firearm type, a tailored bolt action from a period long gone. But more than that, he identified the expression in Harlan's eyes. It was the expression of a man for whom the firearm was not an instrument for recreation, but in prolongation of his determination. Kane had observed sufficient. He retrieved his phone, his finger gliding across the display with intent. He didn't contact security or the range overseer. He had a separate contact in his list. He dispatched a text to a man he had served with 20 years prior, a man who was now Colonel Harlan, the base's head of personnel. The note was brief and straightforward. Colonel, head to range 7 immediately. There's a living icon on the row being handled like an idiot by your fresh enlistees. His name is Harlan Graves. You need to manage this yourself. Kane stowed the phone. His expression was stern. He knew the name Harlan Graves would be like an explosion detonating in the headquarters. He relaxed back to observe. He knew the discharge hadn't occurred yet, but the conflict for range 7 was already concluded. The reinforcements were en route. Inside the temperature-regulated tranquility of the base operations hub, Colonel Harlan glanced at his phone, his forehead creasing in irritation at the disturbance. The all-Marine contest was proceeding without issues, and he was occupied organizing with the dignitaries present. But the message was from Josiah Kane, and Kane wasn't prone to exaggeration. He reviewed the message twice. Harlan Graves, he muttered to himself. The name was recognizable, a murmur from the profound legacy of the Corps, but he couldn't pinpoint it. He addressed his assistant, a keen captain nearby. Captain, do me a service. Search the name Harlan Graves through the military history archive. Cross-check with today's participant list for the rifle contest. Aye, sir, the captain replied, pivoting to his console. He entered the name. For an instant he gazed at the display, his digits immobilized over the keys. Then his eyes expanded. He leaped to his feet so rapidly his seat scraped back and almost overturned. Sir, he uttered, his tone a pressing, choked murmur. You need to view this. Colonel Harlan approached with an impatient expression on his face. He examined the screen, and the color left his face. It wasn't a typical military record. It was a phantom document, a densely censored file that was more obscured text than content. There was a lone blurry image from the 1960s displaying a young man with aged eyes and a face as tough as steel. The document cataloged honors that were the essence of Marine Corps lore. A Navy Cross, then another, and then at the summit, a reference for the Medal of Honor, the specifics of which were restricted at a level the colonel himself couldn't reach. Underneath it, a lone enigmatic notation, Project Hawkeye, primary sharpshooter. Effectiveness rating 100%. Harlan felt a shiver ascend his back. Project Hawkeye was a covert operations initiative from Vietnam, a sniper program so confidential it was formally refuted to have ever occurred. And this man was its chief operative. Contact the base leader on the line, Harlan ordered sharply, his voice strained with excitement. Inform him it's a Code Alpha legacy matter. Then secure me a vehicle and a protection team. We are heading to Range 7, and we are moving quickly. Back on the sun-scorched shooting row, the directive was issued. Marksman, you may begin discharging when your mark is prepared. A sequence of crisp snaps resounded along the row as the other Marines started their sequences of shots. Sergeant Reese, keen to perform, dispatched 5 projectiles downrange in rapid order. The digital display above his position revealed a compact, commendable cluster in the central circle. He manipulated his mechanism and peeked over at Harlan's position with a conceited smile. The elderly man hadn't even discharged yet. He was still reclining there, utterly immobile, as if he were integrated into the terrain. "Hey, Grandpa, you going to fire that thing or just doze off?" Reese shouted, his voice resounding and distinct over the sporadic gunfire. "Better rush before the breeze shifts or before your joint fails." It was a shocking violation of protocol, a straightforward and offensive jeer during an active shooting occasion. Gunnery Sergeant Harlan whirled around, his face becoming a deep hue of crimson. "Reese, attend to your position. That's your last alert." But Harlan didn't appear to perceive them. The environment had contracted to the tiny ring of illumination at the end of his antique optic. The lens was aged, but it was immaculate German crystal, more transparent and luminous than any of the bulk-manufactured glasses in the contemporary optics. He perceived the mark not as a sheet of material, but as an issue to be resolved. He sensed the faint alteration of the breeze against his face, computed the descent, and allowed his respiration to decelerate until the surroundings seemed to decelerate alongside it. His digit rested on the activator. It was then that a fresh noise started to encroach, a subdued rumble from behind them that increased progressively louder. It wasn't storm sounds, it was the noise of potent motors traveling at velocity. Heads began to rotate down the extended pebble entry path. A convoy of dark command transports and military enforcement vehicles was nearing, stirring up a plume of dust. They didn't reduce speed for the parking zone. They proceeded directly onto the lawn behind the shooting row, halting in a flawlessly arranged, daunting formation. Their crimson and azure lights blinked in the vivid sunlight, but their alarms stayed mute, which was somehow more threatening. Doors opened in flawless, coordinated harmony. Out emerged the base leader himself, a 2-star general, his attire spotless, his face a veil of severe intent. He was accompanied by Colonel Harlan and a phalanx of sergeants major, the top-ranking non-commissioned officers on the base. The impact was immediate. The discharging ceased. The talk ended. The whole range, populated with some of the most lethal sharpshooters globally, descended into a shocked, complete stillness. A general didn't simply visit a shooting range. An entrance like this signified one of 2 possibilities: a disaster or the resurrection. Gunnery Sergeant Harlan, his face now ashen, groped for his signal device and emitted a keen, penetrating blast. "Halt fire! Halt fire! Empty and display clear!" He shouted, his voice fracturing with an anxiety he couldn't hide. The general disregarded all. He marched past the stunned Sergeant Reese as if he were an item of decor. He passed the gunnery sergeant. His eyes, like fragments of azure frost, were fixed on one individual, the elderly man in the worn marksmanship coat, who was now gradually and somewhat rigidly elevating himself from the soil. The general paused 3 feet in front of Harlan Graves. He remained for a moment, his stare absorbing the elderly man and the archaic firearm he grasped. Then, in a gesture so acute and exact it seemed to slice the atmosphere, he executed the most flawless salute of his extensive and notable profession. His hand did not tremble. His stance was ideal. "Mr. Graves." The general's voice resounded, projecting across the quiet range with the complete authority of his leadership. "It is a privilege to have you on our range, sir." Harlan regarded the general, a glimmer of astonishment in his aged eyes, and offered a gradual, straightforward nod of recognition. Colonel Harlan advanced, clutching a portable device. "Sergeant Reese," he commanded. Reese, who appeared as though he might collapse, jerked to alertness. "You and your squad, you will remain at attention until I instruct differently." They hurried to obey, their expressions a blend of dread and complete bewilderment. The colonel glanced at his device, then back at the gathered Marines. "For the instruction of those who have overlooked the significance of esteem," he commenced, his tone chilly and distinct. "Let me inform you who you are in the company of Harlan Graves, joined the United States Marine Corps, 1965, Duty Republic of Vietnam, 1st Marine Division, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." He halted, permitting the revered unit label to linger in the atmosphere. He battled at Khe Sanh, at Hue City, at locations whose titles are now inscribed into the surfaces of our sanctuaries. He was granted the Navy Cross for bravery in combat, and then he was granted a 2nd Navy Cross for bravery in combat. The colonel inhaled, and for his deeds on Hill 881, where he individually repelled an adversary force for 36 hours, equipped with scarcely more than the firearm he holds in his hands today, he was granted the Medal of Honor. A shared intake of breath passed through the assembly. The grins and murmurs were absent, substituted by a surge of astonishment and deep, modest reverence. The young Marines regarded Harlan, not as an elderly man, but as a giant from their chronicles, animated. And one additional detail Colonel Harlan appended, his eyes locating Reese's. In 1988, at this exact range, then Gunnery Sergeant Graves employed that identical firearm and that identical museum piece optic to establish the 1,000-yard single-discharge course benchmark, a benchmark which for 35 years, every Marine on this base, including you, Sergeant, has attempted and been unable to surpass. The general at last dropped his salute and directed his icy stare upon Reese. His voice was not elevated, but it was substantial, each term a sledge strike. "Sergeant, this corps is a dwelling. It is a dwelling constructed on the offering of men like him. You are a visitor in that dwelling. You do not deride the designers. You derided his firearm. That firearm has witnessed more battle than your whole unit combined. You derided his years. Those years were gained in forests you can't even envision, struggling for the very liberty that provides you the entitlement to don that attire." He approached nearer, his voice reducing to a near murmur. "You are dismissed from your responsibilities. You will present to the base sergeant major. Your fresh assignment location is the base archive. You will devote every day for the next month sanitizing the exhibits, and you will absorb the narrative behind every arm, every attire, and every champion in that structure. Is that comprehended?" "Yes, General." Reese gasped out, his face pallid as linen. Harlan Graves finally vocalized. He advanced and positioned a tender hand on the general's crisp cuff. "General," he remarked, his voice serene, "the lad is youthful. We were all youthful once, brimming with energy and spirit, anxious to demonstrate we fit in." He shifted his gaze to Reese, and there was no animosity in it, only a profound, exhausted insight. "Son," he remarked, "this firearm, this optic, they aren't about the innovation. It's about esteem. Esteem for your gear, esteem for your comrades in arms, and above all, esteem for yourself. A firm hand and a sharp eye don't originate from a plant. They originate from here," he remarked, patting his chest, and from here he patted his forehead. "It's the sharpshooter, not the firearm." As his hand lingered on the optic, another recollection acute and distinct emerged. A soggy trench, the atmosphere dense with moisture and apprehension. His observer, Ramon, a youth from San Antonio, who always had a quip prepared. An opponent's sharpshooter had them trapped. Ramon utilized a helmet on a rod as a lure. A discharge sounded. The helmet soared. Ramon smiled. "Got him," he murmured. A fraction of a second later, another discharge. A deflection from a stone whizzed past Harlan's head and hit the optic of his firearm with a fierce snap. The collision rotated the firearm, preserving his eye, perhaps his existence. Ramon, ever inventive, extracted a container of adhesive from his kit. A good luck blemish, he'd remarked as he repaired the profound indentation in the metal. The following day, Ramon was departed, a casualty of a shell assault. The optic wasn't merely a fragment of lens and alloy. It was the final item a comrade had ever contacted. It was a vow. The general, touched by Harlan's terms, merely nodded. He addressed the astonished range supervisor. "Gunny, evacuate the shooting row." Everyone away except for Mr. Graves. The range was vacated in unprecedented time. The assembly of Marines, including a modest and contrite Reese, positioned back in a mute, devout half-circle. The general regarded Harlan. "Sir," he uttered gently, "the row is yours." Harlan provided another gradual nod. He returned to his pad and positioned into his stance as if he were solitary. He didn't assess the breeze again. He didn't recalibrate his optic. He merged with the firearm, a fluid amalgamation of individual and apparatus. He inhaled in. He exhaled out. The firearm snapped. A solitary, acute report that resounded across the hushed valley. For an extended moment, nothing transpired. Everyone restrained their respiration, their eyes fastened on the sizable digital screen that showed the mark outcomes. Then a figure appeared on the display, a flawless 10, a precise center target. But it was beyond that. The computing system evaluating the discharge's location to 1,000th of an inch noted a cluster so accurate it was nearly a numerical improbability. The former benchmark established by a younger Harlan Graves 35 years prior appeared on the display, and then adjacent to it, the fresh tally emerged. He had surpassed his own unbreakable benchmark. The quiet shattered. It wasn't courteous clapping, it was a bellow, a profound resounding acclaim of pure genuine esteem from hundreds of United States Marines for one of their kin. The narrative of Harlan Graves' comeback became an immediate myth on the base. The occurrence was converted into a required instruction segment for all groups, a potent teaching on tradition, modesty, and the serene courage of the eras that preceded. Sergeant Reese was indeed relocated. The haughtiness was removed from him, replaced by a serene thoroughness as he absorbed the narratives carved into the metallic markers at the base archive. 1 month later, on a tranquil Saturday afternoon, the archive was almost vacant. Reese, now a private first class, was meticulously shining the glass of a Vietnam War presentation. The entrance squeaked open and Harlan Graves entered clad in a plain collared shirt and trousers. Reese tensed, his pulse racing. He anticipated a reprimand, a concluding term of disapproval, but Harlan just grinned, a benevolent grin, and approached the exhibit container. "This is a fine location," Harlan remarked, his voice mild. "Lots of narratives here." He indicated a combat-worn firearm inside the container, a version identical to his own. Had one just like it. They remained in a relaxed quiet for a moment. Two Marines from two distinct realms linked by the extended continuous chain of the Corps. Reese eventually discovered his voice. "Sir," he remarked, pivoting to confront the elderly man. His eyes were transparent, his remorse substituted by a solid earned esteem. Harlan Graves regarded the young Marine, truly regarded him, and clasped him solidly on the shoulder. "You're absorbing, son," he remarked. "That's all any of us can ever do. Keep absorbing." Harlan pivoted and departed, leaving the young man solitary with the spirits and the myths. Reese observed him depart, then pivoted back to the glass. In his image, he no longer perceived an arrogant ace. He perceived a Marine who was finally starting to comprehend the profound burden and privilege of the attire he wore. The champions who traverse among us often bear the heaviest narratives with the most serene poise. If you were touched by Harlan Graves' narrative of courage, demonstrate your backing by liking this video, distributing it with a companion, and subscribing to BR Veteran Stories.